My uncle laughed and said, "You're only here because you're desperate for attention. Nobody actually wants you around." This was at my grandmother's funeral, the woman who raised me. I stayed silent through the entire service. But when the lawyer read the will, everything went to me. The house, the savings, even the car. My uncle tried to contest it, but then the lawyer played the video message she'd recorded. I, 32M, stayed silent at my grandmother's funeral while my uncle mocked me. Then the lawyer read her will. The funeral home smelled like lilies and old wood, the kind of scent that clings to your clothes for days afterward. I sat in the back row because I knew what was coming. My uncle had that look on his face, the one he always wore when he wanted to remind me of my place in the family hierarchy. He'd been circling me since I arrived, like a shark that had caught the scent of blood in the water. It happened right before the service started. I was standing by the guest book, trying to hold myself together, when he approached with two of my cousins flanking him. He looked at me with this twisted smile and said I was only there because I was desperate for attention, that nobody actually wanted me around. The words hit like a physical blow, but I'd learned long ago that reacting to him only made things worse. My cousins snickered behind him, and a few relatives nearby pretended not to hear. I walked back to my seat without saying a word. My grandmother had raised me since I was 8 years old. My parents died in a car accident on a rainy November night, the kind of tragedy that splits your life into before and after. She took me in without hesitation, even though she was already in her 60s and had earned her retirement. My uncle, her eldest son, had always resented this. He'd made it clear over the years that I was an obligation she'd taken on, not a real part of the family. His 3 children grew up hearing the same message, and they treated me accordingly. The service was beautiful in the way that funerals are when someone was genuinely loved. Person after person stood up to talk about her kindness, her strength, her unwavering sense of justice. I couldn't bring myself to speak. Every time I thought about standing up, my uncle's words echoed in my head. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, staring at her casket, and let the silence speak for me. After the burial, everyone gathered at a local restaurant for the reading of the will. My uncle had organized it, naturally. He'd always been the one who handled family logistics, the self-appointed patriarch who expected deference and obedience. He sat at the head of the table with his wife beside him, both of them wearing expressions of somber entitlement. I took a seat near the end, next to a cousin who'd at least had the decency to nod at me when I arrived. The lawyer was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that comes from decades of watching families tear themselves apart over money. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. My uncle leaned forward, practically salivating. He'd been talking for weeks about what he'd do with the house, how he'd sell it and split the proceeds, how it was finally time to settle his mother's affairs properly. The lawyer began reading. The house, a modest 3-bedroom ranch in a decent neighborhood, went to me. The savings account, which had accumulated to a surprising amount through decades of careful budgeting, went to me. The car, a 10-year-old sedan that still ran perfectly, went to me. Even the jewelry, the photo albums, the furniture, everything went to me. The room went completely silent. My uncle's face turned the color of raw meat. His wife grabbed his arm, but he shook her off and stood up so fast his chair fell backward. He started shouting that this was impossible, that his mother would never do this, that I must have manipulated her in her final days. The lawyer sat there calmly, letting him rage, her expression never changing. When he finally ran out of steam, she asked if he was finished. He demanded to contest the will. She nodded slowly, like she'd been expecting exactly this reaction, and reached back into her briefcase. She pulled out a tablet and set it on the table. She told us that my grandmother had recorded a video message to be played only if someone contested the will. My uncle tried to object, but the lawyer cut him off. She said he'd made his choice and pressed play. My grandmother's face filled the screen. She looked tired but determined, sitting in her favorite chair with the afternoon light coming through the window behind her. She'd recorded this maybe a month before she died, when the cancer had already started winning, but she was still clear-headed and sharp. She started by saying she knew what she was doing and that her mind was sound. She listed her doctor's name, the date, the witnesses who'd been present. Then she looked directly into the camera and began to speak about my uncle. She said she'd watched him bully me for 24 years. She'd seen how he belittled me at every family gathering, how he made sure his children understood I was lesser than them, how he tried to convince her over and over to spend less on my education and more on his kids. She talked about the time he tried to get her to kick me out when I was 16 because I'd accidentally scratched his car. She mentioned the Thanksgiving when he'd told me I should be more grateful for the charity I'd received, right in front of the whole family. But what really cut deep was when she started talking about the last 5 years. She explained that my uncle had been pressuring her to sign the house over to him, claiming it would be easier for estate planning. He'd brought lawyers to her home, made appointments without telling me, tried to convince her that she was becoming incompetent and needed his help managing her affairs. She'd refused every time, but he'd never stopped trying. Then she said something that made my uncle sink back into his chair. She revealed that she'd lent him $80,000 over the past decade. He'd come to her with sob stories about business investments, medical bills, his kids' education. She'd given him the money because he was her son and she loved him, but he'd never paid back a single dollar. Meanwhile, he'd bought a boat, renovated his kitchen, and taken his family to Europe twice. She looked into the camera with tears in her eyes and said I was the only one who'd never asked her for anything. I'd worked 2 jobs to help with expenses while I was in college. I'd visited her every week without fail. I'd held her hand through chemotherapy and sat with her during the long, scary nights when the pain was too much. I'd been her grandson in every way that mattered, and she wanted me to have everything because I'd earned it through love, not entitlement. The video ended with her saying she hoped her son would learn something from this, but she wasn't optimistic. She said she loved him despite everything, but love didn't mean rewarding bad behavior. The silence after the video ended was deafening. My uncle sat there with his face in his hands. His wife had tears streaming down her cheeks. My cousins looked like they'd been slapped. The lawyer closed her tablet and asked if anyone still wanted to contest the will. Nobody moved. She packed up her briefcase and told me to contact her office within the week to begin the transfer process. She shook my hand, offered her condolences one more time, and left. The restaurant staff started clearing tables around us, probably eager for this drama to end so they could close up. My uncle finally looked at me. He tried to say something, but I held up my hand. I told him I'd heard enough from him for one lifetime. I said his mother had loved him despite his flaws, but I didn't have to. I gathered my coat and walked out while my uncle sat there surrounded by his family, all of them finally understanding exactly how little they'd meant to the woman they'd taken for granted. Update 1. It's been 3 weeks since the will reading, and things have gotten complicated in ways I didn't anticipate. I spent the first few days just sitting in my grandmother's house, which I guess is my house now, trying to process everything. The place still smells like her lavender hand soap and the vanilla candles she loved. I haven't changed anything yet. I'm not sure I can. My uncle tried calling me 6 times the day after the funeral. I didn't answer. Then he started showing up at the house. The first time, I watched through the window as he pounded on the door for 15 minutes before giving up. The second time, he brought his wife. She stood on the lawn, crying while he rang the doorbell over and over. I felt something almost like pity, but then I remembered 24 years of small cruelties, and the feeling passed. On the third visit, he brought a lawyer with him. I finally opened the door. The lawyer was young and uncomfortable, clearly aware he was being used as a prop. My uncle launched into this speech about family and forgiveness, about how his mother would have wanted us to reconcile. He said we should work out a fair distribution of assets, that he wasn't trying to take everything, but surely I could see that keeping it all was morally wrong. I let him finish. Then I asked if he'd brought the $80,000 he owed my grandmother. His lawyer's head snapped toward him with this look of complete surprise, and I realized my uncle hadn't mentioned that particular detail. My uncle's face went red, and he started stammering about how that was different. Those were loans, not gifts, and there was no documentation. I told him my grandmother had kept meticulous records and that her lawyer had copies of everything. I said if he wanted to contest the will based on fairness, we could start by settling his debts to the estate. His lawyer excused himself and walked back to his car. My uncle stood there for a moment, then left without another word. But here's where it gets messy. My uncle's youngest daughter, my cousin who's 23, reached out to me. We'd never been particularly close, but she wasn't cruel like her siblings. She asked if we could meet for coffee, said she wanted to talk away from her parents. We met at a place downtown. She looked nervous, stirring her drink without drinking it. She told me she'd had no idea about the money her father borrowed. about the pressure he'd put on my grandmother. She said growing up, she'd been told I was the family burden, that their grandmother had sacrificed her golden years to raise someone else's child while her real grandchildren got less attention and resources. She apologized. She said she believed the narrative because it was all she knew, but watching that video had shattered something. She'd gone home and started asking questions, and her father had exploded. There'd been a huge fight. Her mother had admitted that yes, my grandmother had given them money repeatedly, and yes, my uncle had tried to get power of attorney near the end. My cousin asked if there was any way we could have a relationship separate from the rest of the family. She said she understood if I said no, but she wanted to try. I told her I'd think about it, which seemed to be enough for now. The house itself is worth more than I expected. I had an appraiser come through, mostly just to understand what I was dealing with. The neighborhood has appreciated significantly over the past decade. Between the house and the savings, I'm looking at enough money to completely change my life. I could pay off my student loans, maybe buy a small business or invest in something stable. But I can't stop thinking about what my grandmother said in that video. She wanted me to have this because I'd earned it through love, not entitlement. The thought of selling her house, of erasing that last physical connection to her, feels like a betrayal somehow. I've been going through her things slowly. She kept everything. I found boxes of my school projects, every card I'd ever given her, photographs from every birthday and holiday. In her nightstand, I found a journal she'd been keeping since I came to live with her. I haven't been able to read more than a few pages at a time. She wrote about her fears of raising a grieving child, her determination to give me stability, her frustration with her son's behavior. There was an entry from about 5 years ago where she wrote about my uncle trying to convince her to put him on the deed to the house. She described feeling betrayed, but not surprised. She wrote that she'd already decided everything would go to me, but his pressure had confirmed she was making the right choice. The strangest thing has been the reaction from extended family. My grandmother had 3 sisters, all still alive, and they've been calling to check on me. 2 of them have outright said they're proud of how my grandmother handled things. The third, my great-aunt who's 91, told me she'd stopped speaking to my uncle years ago after he'd borrowed money from her and never paid it back either. Apparently, this was a pattern nobody had discussed openly. I also discovered that my grandmother had set up a small trust fund when I was 8, right after my parents died. She'd been putting $100 a month into it for 24 years. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to make me realize how long she'd been planning to take care of me, how deliberate all of this was. My uncle sent a letter, not through a lawyer this time, just a handwritten note that arrived in my grandmother's mailbox. He said he was sorry for how he'd treated me over the years, that grief and stress had made him say things he didn't mean at the funeral. He claimed he'd never meant to exclude me from the family, that he'd been trying in his own flawed way to toughen me up, to prepare me for a world that wouldn't coddle me. The letter felt hollow. There was no mention of the money, no acknowledgement of the pressure he'd put on his dying mother, no real accountability for 2 decades of casual cruelty. It read like something his wife had made him write, an attempt to look reasonable in case this ever ended up in court. I haven't responded. I'm not sure there's anything to say. My grandmother said her piece, and she said it better than I ever could. Update 2. It's been 4 months now, and I'm writing this from my grandmother's porch, my porch, watching the sun set over the neighborhood where I grew up. I've made my decision about the house, and it feels right in a way I didn't expect. I'm keeping it. I'd been going back and forth, listening to financial advisors talk about investment opportunities and market conditions, but none of it felt true to what my grandmother wanted. She didn't leave me this house as an asset to liquidate. She left it as a home, and I'm going to honor that. I've started renovating, carefully. I'm not erasing her presence, just updating things she'd been meaning to fix. New roof, updated plumbing, fresh paint in colors I think she'd like. I found her wish list in a kitchen drawer, things she'd wanted to do but couldn't afford or didn't have the energy for toward the end. I'm working through it like a blueprint. The situation with my uncle reached a conclusion of sorts. He hired another lawyer, a more aggressive one this time, and filed a formal contest of the will. He claimed undue influence, said I'd isolated my grandmother from her family in her final years and manipulated her into changing her estate plan. It was ugly. His lawyer sent interrogatories asking about every visit, every conversation, every dollar I'd spent on her care. They subpoenaed her medical records, trying to prove diminished capacity. They even questioned some of her friends and neighbors. looking for anyone who'd say I'd been controlling or suspicious. They found nothing. Instead, they found a dozen people who told stories about my uncle's behavior. The neighbor who'd seen him yelling at my grandmother on her front lawn about the house deed. Her doctor who remembered my uncle trying to get information about her mental state without proper authorization. Her priest who'd counseled her through her conflicted feelings about her son's demands. The breaking point came when my grandmother's lawyer produced not just the video, but a series of written statements my grandmother had made over the past 3 years. She'd documented every time my uncle had asked for money, every pressure tactic, every attempt to undermine her independence. She'd even recorded phone conversations in accordance with state law. The recordings were devastating, my uncle's voice dripping with impatience as he explained to his elderly mother why she was too confused to manage her own affairs. His lawyer withdrew from the case. The contest was formally dropped. The legal fees cost my uncle somewhere north of $30,000, money he apparently didn't have readily available. I heard through family channels that he'd had to take out a loan. I felt nothing when I heard. No satisfaction, no vindication. Just a deep tiredness that this was what it had come to. My cousin, the one who'd reached out earlier, has become something unexpected, a real friend. We've been meeting regularly, and she shared more about her father's behavior at home. The family is fracturing. Her older brother still defends their father completely, refuses to believe he did anything wrong. The middle sibling has gone non-contact with everyone, apparently unable to handle the cognitive dissonance. My cousin is trying to find her own path, separate from her parents' narrative. She asked if she could have one of my grandmother's necklaces, something to remember her by. I gave her 3 pieces my grandmother wore regularly. She cried when I handed them over. I think it was the first time anyone had acknowledged that she'd lost someone too, that grief wasn't exclusive to me just because I'd been the primary heir. I've started hosting Sunday dinners at the house. My grandmother's sisters come, along with a few family friends who knew her for decades. My cousin comes when her parents are out of town. We cook her recipes and tell stories about her. Last week, her youngest sister told a story I'd never heard about my grandmother confronting a racist teacher in the 1960s and getting her fired. The woman was a force of nature long before I knew her. These dinners feel like the house is alive again. My grandmother always said a home is meant to be filled with people and laughter. I'm trying to build that, my own version of the family she created. I used some of the money to establish a scholarship fund in my parents' names. It's for kids who've lost parents and are being raised by relatives. Not a huge amount, but enough to help with college expenses or vocational training. My grandmother had helped me get through school with her savings. This feels like extending that gift forward. My uncle doesn't come to the dinners. I haven't invited him, and he hasn't asked. I've seen him twice in passing, once at a grocery store and once at the bank. Both times, he looked at me and looked away. There was something defeated in his posture, a shrinking I'd never associated with him before. Part of me wonders if I should reach out, if my grandmother would have wanted reconciliation. But then I remember what she said in that video. Love doesn't mean rewarding bad behavior. She loved her son enough to tell him the truth about what he was, even if it meant cutting him out of her will. That was its own kind of love, the hard kind that refuses to enable. I don't hate him anymore. Hate requires too much energy, too much continued investment. He's just someone I used to know, someone who chose greed over relationship and is now living with the consequences. The house is quiet tonight in the way old houses are, full of small creaks and settling sounds that used to scare me as a kid. My grandmother would tell me those were just the house breathing, that every home has its own life. I understand what she meant now. This place holds memories in its walls, in the scuffed hardwood floors and the doorframe where she marked my height every birthday. I'm building my life here, in the space she made for me. I'm 32 years old, and I finally have a home that's truly mine, earned through decades of showing up, of loving someone without expectation of reward. My uncle spent those same decades calculating his inheritance and lost everything that mattered. My grandmother taught me that in the end, what you leave behind isn't money or property. It's the mark you make on the people who love you, the way you shape them to be better than they would have been without you. She left me everything, but the real inheritance was the example she set: how to love fiercely, how to stand up for what's right, how to build a family based on choice rather than obligation. I'm living in her house, but I'm building my own legacy. And every Sunday, When I set the table for dinner and fill the rooms with people who choose to be here, I can feel her smiling. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with friends or family who might enjoy it too.